Welcome to News Talk with Simone Ivani at the International News Channel. A new research report conducted by Pew Research Center is focusing on India's population and revolves around religious identity, nationalism, and religious tolerance. The report, which is based on just under 30,000 interviews with Indian adults, was conducted between 2019 and 2020. It was conducted in 17 languages and covers nearly all of India's 28 states and 8 union territories. Some of the key findings for this report include that Indians value religious tolerance, although they prefer to live religiously segregated lives. 2/3 of Hindus believe that Hindu women or men shouldn't be marrying into other religious communities. For many Hindus, national identity, religion, and language are closely connected. 64% of Hindus believe that it is important to be Hindu in order to be truly Indian, while 80% also say it is very important to speak Hindi to be truly Indian. Amongst Hindus, views of national identity go hand in hand with politics. The ruling Bharatiya Janata Party has great support from Hindus who closely associate their religious identity and the Hindi language with being truly Indian. To discuss this survey and their findings, we are joined by Suhag Shukla. Suhag Shukla is the co-founder and executive director at Hindu American Foundation. She has a BA in religion and JD from the University of Florida. She's a strong advocate of human rights and religious freedom. Thank you for joining us today, Suhag.
Thank you for having me.
Right off the bat, I guess I want to ask you, was there any findings in the research study that surprised you?
Oh, a lot. You know, it's, I think, 233 pages, so there's a lot to digest. And you know, the thing about statistics is that you can do a quick read through, but then how do different statistics maybe inform other statistics? So oftentimes these surveys require a first read, a second read, sometimes even a third read. But I'd say overall, the story is largely one that reflects not the headlines of the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, or BBC when it comes to religion in India. It reflects far more the stories that I've experienced on my frequent visits back, as well as the experiences of my friends and family who live there. To me, India has always been a country where religious pluralism and diversity and side-by-side coexistence is a way of life, and that's exactly what I think the Pew Research survey has found. They describe it as a patchwork, and I think that that's a very apt description of interreligious relations in India.
The study found that while majority of Indians across all 6 major religious groups valued religious tolerance, the majority of individuals interviewed also advocated for segregation based on religious lines and advocated against interfaith marriage. Why do you think that Indians prefer to live and marry amongst people of their own faith and segregated from others?
Yeah, I think that I don't see those statistics or even that finding as any different from any other human society. We as humans are attracted to people who are like us, when it comes to marriage and things like that, people are thinking, at least a lot of people are thinking about future generations, child rearing, wanting to have a marriage succeed, and many times having commonalities, having a shared culture, especially things like religion that might inform day-to-day interactions, are important. So, you know, to see that Indians as a whole prefer to marry within their own is probably not all that different from the rest of the world. I think maybe where things are a little bit different are the living situation. And, you know, I think that, you know, oftentimes for the United States, and I don't know how it is in Canada, but we're described as a melting pot. And, you know, even though the United States is oftentimes called a melting pot, I've always actually used the analogy of a salad. We have tomatoes, we have carrots, we have lettuce or spinach or whatever. And the thing that kind of brings it all together is a good dressing. And maybe you can look to like the American dream or, you know, shared American values in democracy, in secularism, and in, you know, equality and justice. Maybe those are all the things that kind of hold it all together. So in that sense, in the United States, sure, people say melting pot, but we do have our little Italies. We do have our Chinatowns and little Korea, little Saigon, Greek town. I mean, so many examples of where people have built communities and chosen to live together amongst their own. So, maybe we see that in a more, maybe it appears more exaggerated in India, but I think we need to keep in context that it's, first of all, a far older civilization as opposed to, say, the United States. Second is geographically, you're looking at a far more densely populated region. So, whether the Western melting pot formula is a one-size-fits-all, I would challenge that presumption. So even a word like segregation, I think, carries a lot of judgment with it. And Pew Research does value itself or pride itself on being nonpartisan. So in some sense, that word, maybe if you're just looking at it as a word, isn't that loaded, but I think in the context of the United States, it certainly has, because this country has had a long history of segregation, specifically impacting the African American community. That said, I think that if this side-by-side living in India is happening as a result of mutual preference, out of mutual respect, and coming from a place of preference as opposed to, say, prejudice and discrimination, I think that just shows us that's what's worked in India. And I think that we find that model actually far more across the globe, where you have multi-ethnic and multi-religious societies living side by side.
So in your opinion, you would say that religious tolerance and religious-based segregation can exist simultaneously?
I mean, I think we see it. I think we see it in India, in that sense that there, on the whole, you saw that. I think I can pull up the percentages exactly, but it was something like 80% of every religious community in India saying that they're free to practice religion, and the difference between Hindus and Muslims was just 2 percentage points. 80% said across religions that respecting other religions is important in general, and 84% of all Indians said that respecting other religions is very important to being Indian. And 65% of both Hindus and Muslims reported or responded that communal violence does occur, and it's a big that if communal violence occurs, that it's a big concern. So I think looking at all of these statistics together, again, to my first point, that we have to look at how a lot of these questions might be interrelated, and where you have a story where the vast majority of people personally value respecting other religions, as a whole, for a healthy Indian society, value respecting other religions. I think that all of those things need to be looked at holistically.
So speaking of percentages, I'm going to just ask you a couple of questions that are based on the study itself. So another thing that we found from the study was that India's caste system continues to fracture society. So for example, 70% of Indians said that most or all of their friends share their same caste. 64% of Indians say it is very important to stop women from their respective communities from marrying into other castes. And 62% said that it is very important to stop men from doing the same. So what do you think about that?
So, I have read those sections, and I think that there's a larger story to be told there. Caste is one of these things that, in the Indian context, it's a legal fiction in terms of its, at least the way the survey asked the questions, in terms of distinguishing between scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, and other backward castes, and then what they categorized as general castes. So what we find, I think, if I recall correctly, and I'm not an expert on the survey, I'm just a reader like, everyone else outside of the Pew Research team, but I think that regardless of religion, most said that they had this preference. So whether it's religious preference or caste preference, I think that we saw that across the board. I think that what a lot of Westerners may not know is that a lot of the traditions, that each community or caste, whatever we want to call it, have sometimes shared origin legends, have shared histories, have shared deity traditions, might have certain festivals and rites that they celebrate. And they might have a shared occupation. I mean, there's a number of things that might kind of provide a cohesiveness within the larger religious identity that's more community-based. So I suppose that's not surprising. I think what's important to also note that 80% of all Indians, regardless of their caste, reported that they had not personally faced discrimination based on caste in the year prior to taking the survey. So again, I think that we could probably do a deeper dive into the findings, but what exactly caste is outside of these, two kind of broad categories of the administrative designations and general, we don't really kind of get an idea from the survey.
From that, yeah. Speaking of sharing, despite the differences between Hindus, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Buddhists, and Jains, this report found that there were also some shared religious practices and beliefs. These included wearing a bindi amongst Sikh, Christian, and Hindu women, and the belief in karma amongst Muslim, Hindu, and Christians. Moreover, 7% of Indian Hindus celebrate Eid and 17% celebrate Christmas. So in your opinion, what does this say about Indian society?
I think it says exactly what I've seen. I'll tell you a story of my husband's ancestral town. My in-laws had the honor of housing the local goddess, the Murti, in their home while a new temple was being constructed.
Oh, wow.
And their house helper, who happened to be Muslim, took on the same vrat that my aunt-in-law did, because she had such deep devotion for the goddess. Another story is in my father's ancestral town. I was born and raised in the United States, but recently we had a chance as a family to go back, and our family sponsors a Ayurvedic dental tooth removal camp. And so the camp was hosted in the local temple, and you saw lining up the town's Christians and Muslims to not only have this treatment done, which was there as a service for the community, for anyone who had dental ailments and didn't have necessarily the means to take care of them. But I also noticed that as they entered, there was a little bit of a bowing because we were in a temple, immense respect given to the space. And a third story I'll give is in my mother's ancestral village, for instance, when there's a marriage procession for either of the communities, the band kind of quiets down as they're going past one another's houses of worship. So syncretism and side-by-side peaceful coexistence, I think, has been the story of India largely. That's not to deny that there are incidents of tension and violence. But I really did find very surprising some of the statistics. Indian Christians, 54% believing in karma, 29% believing in reincarnation. And Muslims, as you mentioned, 77%. That was even with Hindus believing in karma, 27% believing in reincarnation. So I think they reflect what so many of us see on our visits back, or for people who live there.
Well, I've lived here most of my life, and I feel like I only hear stories like these from people like you who have been there and are kind of helping around. I haven't been back in a very long time, so thank you for sharing those. That actually makes my heart very happy. To even just to hear things that, like, people are doing that, and Indian society is still it's still moving forward.
I think so. The media coverage, especially in the last couple of years, has been just so vitriolic. And, I know that oftentimes people say that good news isn't news and only bad news makes the headlines and allows people to read. But I think there's a big difference here. There's a matter of accuracy that we have not been seeing. And, when you have political polarization coming to heads with mistrust of the media. I think the only things that get harmed are us as citizens and democracy as a viable governing structure. We have to have accurate information. We have to have trust in our media that they are speaking truth to power. And so I hope that we see more coverage of this Pew Research survey, or at least the survey results informing how the story of India is told.
You mentioned melting pot earlier. So the report stated, and I quote, while people in some countries may aspire to create a melting pot of different religious identities, many Indians seem to prefer a country more like a patchwork fabric with clear lines between groups. What do you think are the benefits of a country which is more like patchwork fabric versus about a country which is more like a melting pot?
You know, I think that we really need to look at the histories, the cultural context of any country. As an American, I have seen my own government going to other countries and trying to force fit an American brand of democracy or an American brand of, coexistence on places where it may not necessarily fit. So I think it's incumbent upon local communities to figure out what works for them, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who are either going to benefit from it or pay the price.
Speaking of an overall general thing, do you think that this study, which is dealing with religions in India, was needed?
That's a judgment call that I haven't really thought about. I think that information like this is important for us to have because data should be driving policy. Data should be driving diplomacy. And data, I think, is helpful in also meeting the needs of our societies. We need to have governments that are responsive, especially a democracy, is responsive to the needs and desires of its population. Now, surveys can also be rife with problems. How are the questions asked, for instance, and especially for something as complex as religion? I think that no survey is going to be perfect in that end. And I'll give you one example. The question on yoga, for instance, I think other surveys have found that 11% of Americans practice yoga. Now, when we're looking at that sort of statistic, what people are thinking of yoga is just asana. And asana alone is not yoga. This is something that the Hindu American Foundation has been at the forefront of in terms of educating the global public about what yoga is. Yoga is a spiritual discipline that might be a path of service, that might be a path of devotion, it might be a path of knowledge seeking, or it might be a path of meditation. And so yoga is not just something that happens on the mat. So when you have questions like, do you practice asana? And you get, I think the response was 13%. I think that the conclusion from that is most Indians don't practice yoga, because there was another question about meditation, for instance, where I think half of adults reported, meditating. I don't know if it was on a weekly basis or daily basis, but all of these things, when you take a kind of myopic view, and maybe not myopic or even Abrahamic view towards religions, where things like church attendance are the defining factor, or the number of times you practice, or maybe not the defining factor, but part of the definition, or the number of times you pray a day. Those types of questions are ill-fitted, I think, for the dharmic traditions that tend to be more open, that have so much inherent diversity and religious freedom in terms of leaving it to the individual on how they're going to live out their spiritual life.
So speaking of these questions, if you were to personally conduct some sort of, or this kind of similar study, what kind of questions would you ask? Or would you have framed them differently? Would you have asked more questions or additional questions?
I think that, I probably would have framed the words differently, or rather the questions differently, especially when it comes to yoga. Maybe getting into more like ethical values that are part of a tradition would be helpful. And open-ended questions are always good so that you can get to really drill down into what is meant. I have personal experience with they were conducting surveys, but they weren't a statistical survey. They were more qualitative as opposed to quantitative. My husband runs a surgical workshop in India, and we were trying to get to the psychological well-being of parents and children. And as I was going through these survey questions, even in translation, that's another area where, things can get a little bit difficult because each language is different. So when I was asking questions, for example, about extremely important, very important, important, not important at all, those types of scales are actually very difficult, I found, at least, in translating them to the parents that I was talking to, because it's just different contexts and the way that different cultures use language to emphasize things that are important to them. So, I'm not a professional survey taker. I would have to think a little bit more about how I might ask the questions, but I think I would take definitely a more broad approach to questions about religion, and definitely an open approach. And so that's, I think, the best way to approach it. And also really pulling in experts from the tradition, whether it's scholarly or, I think, people who are in those communities, such as swamis or other acharyas and pandits, or temple presidents or whatever it might be, really getting to hear from the stakeholders of how religious life looks on the ground. And maybe that's something that Pew did, but I believe they did take some qualitative questions, but I don't know if those responses have been published.
Yeah. Do you believe Pew missed anything in the study that you would have preferred or liked to see in it?
I will reserve my judgment on that until I have maybe my third reading. It's always easy when you're doing something to look for the gaps. It's a whole different kind of read to look for look for errors or room for improvement. It's a bigger project, I think, to look for gaps.
I feel like every time I read it, I was learning something new every single time I read it. So
absolutely,
it was,
absolutely.
It was a good study. In your opinion, what should people be taking away from this study?
If there's one take home, is read the survey. Look for yourself. I mean, even if you're just looking at the high level findings, I think they're fascinating, and contrast them. Use those as a starting point or a foundation or a lens through which you continue to read the headlines on India. I think that it can really help individuals who are curious about India or are observers of India to have some, the closest to scientifically validated data that's out there, to be able to better understand the real story of India.
What kind of implications, if any, does this study have on your organization?
I think that, our work is to educate the media, educate policymakers, and educate the public at large about Hindus and Hinduism. So obviously the story of India plays a large part in that, both as kind of the sacred geography from which the Hindu tradition emerged, as well as the vast majority of Hindus being in India, and even in the diaspora, the vast majority of Hindus being of Indian origin. So having this sort of data, I think, is really important for our organization in order to educate people proactively, as well as dispel stereotypes and misinformation.
Okay, that's absolutely fair enough. Thank you for joining me today, Suhag. It was great meeting with you.
Likewise, thanks for having me.
Thank you all for tuning in. You're watching the International News Channel. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up to date with our latest videos. Until next time, I am Simone Ivani.